that, I was the pulpit minister at Gastonia Church of Christ. What else? I'm goofy. I'm not too serious about too many things. What else? So I went to Bear Valley. It seems like years and years and years ago, about 20 years ago. And I've got a master's degree in apologetics from Biola University. So that's just the rundown. Oh, I would be remiss if I didn't say this. I'm married happily to my wife, Hillary. I got 4 kids, 2 girls, 2 boys. The oldest of the girls, Nora, is 9, Ren is 7, Amos is 3, and Darcy is 10 months. So it's never a dull moment at the house. So once again, thank you guys for having me here. One of the things that we're going to do this week, just kind of give you the lay of the land, is we're going to, what I like to do, mix and match this week. It would be fine and dandy just to come in and say, all right, well, here's some stuff about how you know God exists, how the resurrection is true. It can give you all the information that you want. But if we don't know how to deploy that information in conversations with people, then what we really have is an accumulation of really cool facts. That's all we have. It's one thing to know about something. It's different to know about it and know how to talk about it as well. And so those are the 2 things that we're going to look at. Normally what I would do is I would role play as an atheist, but I thought about this week and I was like, let's start with how should we talk about our faith with others? Because we live in a culture right now, we live in a society right now, even in the church, we have a culture of, if you disagree with me, that automatically makes you my enemy. Think about it for a second. I was talking about this last night at dinner. Some of you probably don't even know who Walter Cronkite is. But for those of you who are younger, even when I was growing up, there's a time where the newsman just did what? Gave the news. Even if you look at ESPN, which is what I used to do on Saturdays, I used to watch, or when I stayed home from school sick, I used to just watch reruns of ESPN. They just play the same thing over and over again from about 8 in the morning to about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and then ESPN2 would come on. And it was just guys, anchors, sitting there giving you the news and the sports highlights. Now we live in a culture where if you watch the news, there's 57 people on the screen and they're all yelling at each other for 60 seconds and they're like, hey, thanks for that segment. And nobody learned anything. Nobody learned a thing because what do they want? They don't want actual dialogue. They want a gotcha moment. They want a viral moment. They want to be able to go back and say, hey, that Sean Hannity guy, he really laid into that Democrat. Or, man, did you see Wolf Blitzer just kill that guy on TV? And when you really even look at it, I don't mean to get too political, but think about the way that political debates are done. You got 57 people on stage, and they all get 60 seconds to answer how you're going to solve the healthcare crisis. What? Right? There's no dialogue anymore in culture. And so when we talk about things that are sensitive to our emotions, what are the 2 things you're not supposed to talk about Thanksgiving and Christmas? Religion and politics, right? Why? Because they're so emotional. But here's the thing. You can do away with the politics at Thanksgiving and Christmas if you want, but there's one thing that you cannot do away with. And let's talk about your faith. You can't get rid of that. Especially when Jesus commanded us to what? Go into all the world and not talk about what it means to be a disciple. Did he ever say that? No, he didn't say that. Go into all the world and make disciples, right? And so one of the things that we have to be comfortable with and learn how to do, again, in this volatile society, is we have to learn how to talk to people. And here's the thing. It's really easy for me to talk to Cole about the Christian faith. Why? Why is that easy for me to do that with Cole? Because we agree. Bingo, give the man a gold star, right? Because we agree. It's easy for me to talk to people about stuff that we agree on, right? Say again? Yeah, more pleasant too oftentimes. And maybe that's one of the things. Maybe one of the things why are maybe a little bit timid about having that conversation with people is because we come to that conversation with, man, if I talk to my friend who's an atheist about Christianity, it's not going to be pleasant. But who said that conversation has to go bad? Why does the conversation have to go bad? Well, it doesn't. All right, and so this morning, what we're going to look at before we even get into evidence for Christianity is to say, hey, how should we talk to people about Christianity? And so whether you know it or not, every single day that you step out of your door, you're entering a marketplace. You're entering the marketplace of this thing called ideas. Whether you're at work, whether you're at school, whether you're shopping, whether you're driving, whether you're at a gas station, whether you're at Pitt's Barbecue, not ordering barbecue, right? That's what happened last night. You are always engaging with people that have a worldview. A worldview is how you think the world does or ought to work. All right? So you have a Christian worldview, which means you believe that the way reality actually is through the Christian belief system. Now, you go up to Dearborn, Michigan, and it is not the Christian worldview. It is the Muslim worldview, which means they view the world, that the world is actually and ought to be viewed from a Muslim perspective, from an Islamic perspective. All right? Now, you go out to San Francisco, California, that will not be a Christian or a Muslim worldview. That'll be a very secular worldview, humanistic worldview. All right? So you go over to Europe, secular worldview. All right? So worldview is how you believe the world is and ought to be viewed. And everybody has those. And not everybody's is the same. So you're entering in the marketplace, all right, of ideas. Now, if you wake up every morning and you say, well, everybody believes what I believe in the world, you would be called delusional. All right? That is not the case. And so our job as Christians, and this is, I get this from Acts chapter 17, is to go down into the marketplace daily and seek to change minds. That's what Paul did. Over and over again we see in Acts is that Paul goes to the synagogue first, and then he goes into the city. Acts 17 says that Paul went into the synagogue and taught devout people and the Jews, and then he went into the marketplace daily and talked to people who were there. All right? And so we see a cultural shift taking place in the West. Christianity is on pace to be a minority of the American population by 2070. Gen Z, which is like Cole's age and below, twice as likely to be atheist, agnostic, or nuns. Nuns, not Catholic nuns, the N-O-N-E-S. Those are those who would be people who say, I don't identify with a particular denomination or particular class of religion. You hear this a lot. I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. I don't believe or agree with organized religion. Anybody ever heard that before? Those are what we call nuns, right? And a quarter of the country identifies as that. I saw some, Today, 25% of our country identifies as one of those, as nuns, people that aren't tied to a denomination, tied to a religious group. They might say, I'm not a fan of organized religion, and I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about how to address those kind of things. All right, and so this is kind of where the West is headed, right here. If you look, what was it the other day? I heard a story about a guy who was a minister over in Europe, I think like 2 years ago. He stood 150 yards away and was arrested for privately praying 150 yards away from an abortion clinic. Put in jail for thought crime. Well, why? Well, because he got charged with, there's a law that was passed in Britain that said that you couldn't do that. And so they asked him what he was doing. He said, I'm just praying. He said, praying about what? He goes, well, I'm praying for all of these people that are walking into this abortion clinic and the kids that they may kill. So you got to go to jail. You violated the law for thought crime. All right. So what do you notice about this picture? What stands out to you? That's a beautiful church, isn't it? I mean, it is amazingly beautiful. Like well constructed, looks nice. Would be probably really cool to go in it. Where's the access point to the city? Where? You see how far away that beautiful establishment is from the actual city that it's supposed to reach out to? I would argue, in a polite way, that that's us in a lot of ways. Not that building beautiful buildings is a bad thing. I think church buildings should be beautiful. I'm big on, I think, there's nothing wrong with that. Every now and then, church buildings need a facelift. But notice, they could have built that particular building probably somewhere in that city. But it's isolated from the culture. And here's what's happened over the last probably 20 or 30 years with the church. In the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, we grew pretty good. All right, but over the last 20 or 30 years, we have been so focused on the issues taking place within the church that we have failed, that we have struggled to go and reach people outside of it. All right? And so what's happened because of this cultural shift, we no longer know or are confident in talking to people outside of the church about the church. And so we isolate ourselves away from the cities and the people that we're supposed to be reaching. Let me ask you this question. Maybe some of you have or haven't. How often when we go to brotherhood lectureships, is there a conversation about how to reach the lost outside of the church? Well, I've noticed over the last at least 5 or 10 years as I've been going to them, all of the topics are about the things that are going on inside the church. Not that we shouldn't talk about these particular subjects, right? We should have conversations about instrumental worship. There's nothing wrong with that. We should have conversations about the role of women in church, the role of men and women in church. We should have conversations about marriage, divorce, and remarriage. We should have those conversations. But when those things dominate lectureships and we don't equip our people to go outside the church, well, guess what the only thing they know how to talk about is? Instrumental worship. Marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Role of men and women in the church. And so we take that and we go outside and we say, hey, you should come to our church. And they say, well, why should we come to our church? Well, we don't use instruments. And the person on the outside is like, what? Well, what does that have to do with following Jesus? Because they're not spiritually prepared for that conversation. We've put the cart before the horse. All right? And so then we get classified as like, those are weird people. Right? And it's okay to be weird. Right? I'm weird. It's fine. If you're an A&M fan, you're weird. It happens. So what we have to do as the church is we have to train ourselves again about how to have conversations that matter to people on the outside of the church. We can all have conversations about the things that are going on inside the church, but if those are the only things that we talk about, then we will fail to know what are important issues outside of the church that matter to people when it comes to making them disciples. Is that everybody tracking with that? All right. So, we've been called to go into all the world and make disciples. All right? And so, we've been called to do that through conversation. All right? One of the things that's a really pithy statement, I'll just admit, this is my personal opinion, all right, that drives me up the walls when people say, share the gospel and use words if necessary. That's the worst thing that you could ever say to anybody. Because most people are not going to be, I don't know about you, maybe this has happened to you. It hasn't happened to me. I've never just lived my life out in the marketplace of ideas and someone look at my life and be like, I'm ready to be baptized. I've just never had that happen. Someone go, hey, I see the way you're living. You're a Christian? Yeah, I'm ready to be baptized. That doesn't happen, right? It's only through, I would probably say that everybody at this church that's a Christian became a Christian because they had a conversation with someone. A mom, a dad, a preacher, elder, deacon, friend, doesn't matter. They had a conversation with somebody about it. And so here's the thing. What Jesus does consistently throughout his life, what the New Testament church does over and over and over again, they model Christianity in their life, and when the time comes, they speak about it. And they talk about it, and they open their mouth. If you want the church here to grow, that's only going to grow through two things: modeling a Christian life consistently and opening your mouth and talking about it. It does not matter how many programs you have. It does not matter how many gospel meetings you have. It doesn't matter how many conferences you go to. If you fail to open your mouth about why you believe what you believe, nobody will ever know why you believe what you believe. It's crazy, right? And so conversations, you have to be comfortable in having conversations. So how do we do that? How do I have a conversation that is the most important conversation that can ever have anybody, but also the most emotionally charged conversation I'll probably have with somebody that's not a Christian? All right, now let's see what Paul does here. All right, in Acts chapter 17. Now when Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he's waiting for Timothy and Silas, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols, right? So there's two things that takes place with Paul. One, he was provoked. There was something within him that was stirred about what he saw where? In the city. All right? And the city was full of what? Idols. He was in Greece. He's in Athens. So everywhere that he looked, there were these monuments and these statues and these temples built to all of these different gods. And he was provoked. He saw what was going on in this city. He saw what was taking place with these people. He was convinced and convicted by what he believed. He was convinced and convicted by what he saw, and it provoked him. Notice it doesn't say, Paul was waiting for them in Athens. He decided to be complacent by what he saw. I'm going to press in here a little bit. It's not that man's job to go out and save everybody in temple. It's not his job alone. The only way that any church can be successful in saving souls is if they take an observation of their city, they look at it, they see what's going on, and they're provoked in a good way. Isn't that what happened with Jesus? I mean, Jesus oftentimes, as he heals people, says Jesus was moved, provoked with compassion, and so he heals. And so sometimes we have this mindset, and I can speak because I guess, as a preacher, I can say this. If y'all don't like it, y'all can throw tomatoes at me and not invite me back. That's fine. We have a mindset in the church oftentimes is that we pay the preacher this amount of money and he's supposed to go out and do all the evangelism. Where's that model in the New Testament? It's a congregational effort based upon people being provoked by what they see in the city and convinced by what Christ has done for them. To go and talk. All right. Now look what happens here. So he reasoned in the synagogues with the Jews and devout persons in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Let me ask you a question. What would your conversations at this church or wherever you're from look like before worship and after worship if everybody was talking to somebody, maybe not even every day, consistently about their faith? Think about that. Would the conversation be about the weather? Would the conversation be about the Cowboys? Well, maybe for like 5 or 6 minutes. But if it's like, hey, Cole, I had this conversation with somebody at work the other day, and this is how this conversation went. We started talking about Jesus, and they asked me this question, what do you think about that? What if that was just kind of like a part of the culture in all of the churches, across America, that we decided that we are going to consistently dedicate ourselves to talking to somebody down in the marketplace of ideas? We are the firemen running into the house that's on fire to save people. Now, what do you have to do if you're a fireman? What do you have to be comfortable with? If you're a fireman, what do you have to be comfortable with? Fire! You got to be comfortable and composed in the flames, right? I don't know of any fireman that's been a successful fireman that gets up to the house that's on fire and be like, I'm kind of scared. I think I'm going to take a step back. Somebody else go do it. Call the policeman over here to go do that. Right? No, they wouldn't do that. All right, so you've got to be comfortable in the flames. All right? And so what takes place in Acts chapter 17, anybody remember? We're going to see it here in a second, I think. They call Paul a babbler. What does this babbler wish to say? Now, back in Athens, if you think about it, they sat around and all they did was talk about the new stuff. And so if you get called a babbler, you're like, you're saying a lot of stuff without saying anything at all, dude. Like, what's your point? And so we have to be able, in those conversations, to bypass the insults that are going to come our way. They just are. Some people are going to get upset. Some people are going to get mad. And some people are going to insult us. They're just going to mock us. You got to be comfortable with that. All right? Now, how do I do that? I got to understand who that person is. That person is not just flesh and bone. That's a soul that's going to spend eternity somewhere. And if it means getting to a conversation about Jesus by bypassing an insult, I'm all for it. Say whatever you want to me, that's fine. Talk about me, that's fine. But hey, at the end of the day, I'm still going to come back and say, hey, what do you think about Jesus? Like, what's that got to do with Jesus? Okay, I'm a goofy-looking dude that wears green glasses. What does that have to do with, what's that got to do with Jesus? All right. What does the babbler wish to say? Now, notice what Paul does here. There's a difference. There's an inflection point of communication and understanding. Paul understands what they're communicating. They're communicating to him that he's saying a lot of things without saying anything. They're mocking Paul. Now, Paul could come right back and say, well, you guys are just going to hell in a handbasket, so why am I even here? Is that what he does? He bypasses that, understanding the main goal in this conversation is to get this person from this insult to a conversation about Jesus. Just a conversation. Notice I said just a conversation. I did not say, let's get past the insult and get this person in the water. Let's just get to the conversation. I understand this person, where this person is. I understand where they need to go. And if they need to insult me to get to this point, I'm okay with that. Paul then accepts an invitation to go to the Areopagus. He doesn't say y'all are going to hell in a handbasket. He goes, hey, come with me to the Areopagus. All right? And so, what we see in that conversation is this. You have to find points of commonality. If you're going to have a good conversation with somebody, you have to find a point of commonality. Something in common with that person. All right? Notice Paul in Acts, and we'll move through this kind of quickly. In Acts 17, 22 to 23, what does Paul say? He goes, men of Athens, I can see in every way you're very religious, but they're not Christians. Paul just said that they were religious? Well, yeah. Well, why? The city's full of idols. Paul is saying, I agree with you. I can see that from what's taken place in the city that you guys are religious. Just like me. I can see in every way that you deeply care about what's true and what's not true. I care about what's true and what's not true. I can understand that you have a problem with, organized religion. Hey, I'm not going to be here and defend all organized religion. I agree with you. There's some pretty bad things that have happened throughout the history of organized religion. I'm there with you on that. All right? I can see that you grew up and you had a very difficult time growing up in church. Hey, guess what? I know plenty of people that have been there. Or maybe if it's your actual experience, hey, I've been there. There have been times in my own life where I've struggled growing up in the church. I get that. So you got to find points of commonality. You have to develop points about worldviews. All right. So Paul in Acts chapter 17, 24 through 29, what he goes and says, I was passing through the city, and I saw this engraving that said, to an unknown God. Right? Points of commonality, points about worldview. And then what does he do? He uses that piece of commonality to springboard into a conversation about the resurrection. He says, now I come to you to proclaim that which you worship in ignorance. See, in Greece, or in Athens, they were so worried. This is the way that they viewed the gods. The gods up in Mount Olympus. We don't want to make any of them mad. We're going to worship all of the gods. But in case we forget a god, here's our worship altar to the unknown God. So we got all our bases covered. And so he goes on and he says, well, who says, and I'm paraphrasing here, who says that God needs a place to stay? Who says that God is made, of stone or gold or silver? He's not made with hands, right? So he starts to develop points about the worldview. Like, hey, you guys got this worldview thing about God all wrong. He doesn't need a temple. Right? He's the one that has set the marker, the boundaries for our days and our actions. Right? He's the reason why we live, we move, and we breathe, and we have life. Right? So why does he need man's hands? All right? And then we show that Christ is the game changer. At the very end of Acts chapter 17, he says that Jesus essentially, he's appointed one man to come and judge all men for all time based upon the resurrection. So Paul moves from here's this insult to accepting an invitation, right, to make points about a worldview, and then concludes with you need Jesus, right? And what happens there is there's three outcomes. And these are the only three outcomes that are ever going to happen in any conversation you have with people. Some people are going to mock. Some people are going to say, hey, we want to hear more. And some people are going to believe. Now, 2 out of those 3 are good results. I want to hear more, and I believe. And we fixate on the one about mocking all the time. We're so scared to have a conversation. Well, what if they reject me? Or what if I get mad? Or what if I lose a friend? Now, where did Jesus say, go and make disciples, and not do that unless you're going to lose a friend? Hey, go and make disciples unless you get mocked and then go cower in a corner. He didn't say that, right? And there's ways to do that, okay? And so what we want to look at in the last 10 minutes, I want to look at there's 3 questions that need to dominate your conversations with people, all right? And if you have something to write with, I want you to write these down. The first question is, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? This is a question that I use all the time, whether I'm talking to Christians or non-Christians. I use this question with my wife, and you can edit that out on the recording. What do you mean by that? So, it's the good stuff right here, Cole. So, I'm having a conversation with somebody, all right, and they asked me this question. And this has happened all the time in campus debates that I've had, in online discussions I've had. They say, hey, well, do you believe in evolution? Now, normally, what we would do in that situation would be, we would say something like, no, that's the dumbest thing I could ever believe in. Why would I ever believe in that? Or, no, I don't believe that man came from monkeys. What I should ask before I go on the offensive, see, listen, here's the thing. The person that asks the questions controls the conversation. Jesus always asked people questions. Paul always asked people questions. Remember when Paul was arrested and he was in front of Agrippa, and Agrippa goes, do you want to make me a Christian? Well, that's a good question. Paul says, hey, I want to make everybody a Christian, or like me, lest these chains. He's always asking people questions. In the writings that he gives to each congregation, he asks questions. Remember, he asked the Corinthians about their attitude, and he goes, people questioning his power, he goes, hey, you got a choice. Do you want me to come with peace or a stick? That's a good question, right? You choose which one you want. So the person who asks the questions is controlling the conversation. So someone comes to me and says, hey, do you believe in evolution? My first question is, what do you mean by that? Because there's like 8 different definitions for that word. Like, are you asking me, do things change over time? Well, certainly things change over time. That's obvious. Like, I'm 38. I don't look the same as when I was 18. Right? So there's something, in my body that has changed over time. If you're just talking change over time, well, yeah, sure. Things change over time. Are you talking at like are you talking like, hey, everybody has a common ancestor and that we all came from one common ancestor through natural selection and all that jazz? Well, I don't agree with that. Right? So you have to ask the question, what do you mean by that? Someone says, hey, do you believe that God exists? Okay, well, what do you mean by God? Are we talking like Mount Olympus gods? Are we talking Norse gods like, Odin and Thor, not Marvel, Odin and Thor and the Norse gods? Because that's actually on the rise, right? Are you talking like God of like Christianity? Is that what you're talking about? What do you mean when you say, do you believe that God exists? Are you talking like the deistic God of like Thomas Jefferson? Right? Like, what do you mean by God? And now, why do I do that? Let me ask the question. Why do I ask, what do you mean by that? Why do I do that? Why would I do that? Why would that be important in a conversation like this? Yeah. So part of it is, like, let's make sure, as we talked about point 1, let's build a common foundation, right? If they're operating off a particular word or particular understanding, and I'm not in on that, and I think they mean something different, then this is what we're going to do throughout the conversation. So why not just, before we get into the weeds of everything, just say, okay, well, what do you mean by God? What do you mean by evolution? So that I can understand what you're saying. Because too many times where conversations go bad is because one person assumes what the other person is saying, and then they just do this, and nobody ever asks for clarification. This just happens. That's not even just like worldview conversations. That's just conversations in general, right? So, hey, what do you mean by that? It gives me the opportunity to understand where that person is coming from, what they mean, right? So I can better understand them. And it also gives me the opportunity to really, from a strategic standpoint, sit back and see if this person knows what they're talking about. Right? Okay, well, someone comes to me like, hey, do you believe that, we hear this a lot too, do you believe in 100% of the Bible? Like, should we take the Bible 100% literally? Okay, well, what do you mean by that? Like, do I think apocalyptic literature should be interpreted literally? Like there's a literal dragon in Revelation? Is that what you mean? So what do you mean by that? All right, so that's the first question we ask. What do you mean by that? All right, 2, the second question that we want to ask is, how did you get there? How'd you get there? So, someone says, hey, I don't believe that there are moral absolutes. Okay, well, what do you mean by moral absolutes? They give me their understanding. I say, okay, well, how did you get there? How did you get to believing that there are no moral absolutes? That there aren't things that are always right and always wrong? Well, this is how I got there. Now, why do I ask that question? Why is that question important? Okay, so maybe it's a matter of understanding that person's journey from point A to point B. Someone says, and you hear this too, well, I used to go to church, but I don't anymore. Ha! All right, how'd you get there? What do you mean by church, and how'd you get there? Because for me, the number one thing that people want to understand in a conversation, especially when you're talking with strangers, guests that are walking in the door, they want to know that you're sincere about the conversation. How'd you get there? Hey, I see what you're saying. How'd you get there? Tell me your story. And by them telling me my story, I can show them that I'm sincere, because I am. This isn't just a parlor trick, right? I am sincere. I genuinely want to know their story as an individual. And then what that allows me to do, it allows me to get their personal background without asking, well, how'd you grow up? That might be a unpleasant thing to tell somebody or ask somebody. Well, how'd you grow up? You're not a Christian. How'd you grow up? Right? That's a little bit more aggressive than, well, hey, how'd you get there? Yeah, less evasive. And they get to tell me. And then I can just make mental points of their conversation. All right? And I can say, okay, well, this is how they got there. Did they get there through logic and reason? Like, is it a genuine logical progression for them? Or are they operating strictly off of emotion, which gives me an avenue of how I need to approach the rest of the conversation? All right, make sense? All right, last question is this. Is a if-then question is what I like to call it. The if-then question. All right? So, I'll tell you a story. Story time with Dean. I just got back from Iraq in 2006. It was 2007. I was doing a youth internship at the Piedmont Church of Christ in Virginia. My brother was on the Longwood University rugby team. Go Lancers. There you go. If you don't know what a Lancer is, neither do I. Was on the Longwood University rugby team. He wanted me to come out in January to watch him practice. Being a good brother that I am, I decided to do that. I'm sitting there on these cold metal bleachers, and this girl comes up. She sits next to me. She's on the ladies rugby team. She goes, Dean, I got a question for you. Her name was Kaylin Nill. And she said, yeah. I said, what's up? She goes, you're working in like ministry up the road, right? I'm like, yeah, I'm a youth intern. She looked at me right in the face, and she goes, yeah, I'm gay. Am I going to hell? Awkward party of two, your table is ready. And I'm just like, whoa, nobody's ever asked me that question before. And so I did what? I had two options, right? I can either look at her and just be like, it is what it is, handbaskets await. Yeah. So, well, I looked at her and I asked her, and I said, okay, what do you think of Jesus? Did I answer a question? Did I answer a question? Why would I ask her that question? Okay. Boom. I asked her that question because, as I would tell her, I said, because how you answer that question answers your question. I said, what you think about Jesus matters when it comes to things like sexual ethics. I said, and if we just go back and forth and exchange opinions about it, and we don't have a conversation about Jesus, then we're just exchanging opinions, and it's not going to matter what I say. And so I did ask her. I said, well, first of all, let's get terms on the table. What do you mean by gay? What do you mean by hell? What do you mean by that? So she laid them out. So, okay, we have an understanding. Did an 8-week study on the person of Jesus. She didn't become a Christian. But she did say this, which I found to be very encouraging. She said, no Christians talk to me the way that you've talked to me. And at first I pat myself on the back, and then I thought, how many Christians did she talk to? All because I asked a question. One question led to a 8-week study about the person of Jesus and what that means. And at the end of that, at the end of that conversation with the bleachers, I asked her this. I said, if Jesus is who he says he is, then will you be a Christian? And she said, maybe. So now I know who I'm dealing with. I'm dealing with somebody on the fence. All right? Another type of conversation. Say you go with somebody, and I've had this conversation with someone before. Buddy of mine named Eric. He said, I don't believe in moral absolutes. I said, okay, well, what do you mean? What do you mean by that? What do you mean by I don't believe in moral absolutes? Well, I don't believe that there are situations that are always right and always wrong. I said, okay, how'd you get there? How'd you get to that conclusion? So he lays that out to me. It's like, okay. And then I asked him, I said, okay, well, if it's true that there are no moral absolutes, then saying there are no moral absolutes is a moral absolute. Right? And he just paused. And he thought about it. And he said, no. I was like, okay. And just go right back through it. Okay, so why? If moral absolutes don't exist, then to say that no moral absolutes exist is you're making an absolute statement about morality. So you've chopped the branch off that you're sitting on, right? And so these if-then questions are designed to draw a conclusion on the basis of the two previous questions. What do you mean by that? How did you get there? Once I know what somebody means, and once I know how they got there, I can ask a question that draws them to the conclusion of the stuff that they've said. Does that make sense? Yes or no? So, and Paul doesn't in and of himself do this, but this is a great way to finally kind of like drive home the point of the conversation. So, if someone says, I don't believe that God exists, okay, well, what do you mean by God? How did you get there? Just introductory question. Okay, well, if I could show that God does exist, then would that change your mind? Or would that then move you closer to believing that God exists? Would that man then make you a deist, right? And what we want to do with that question is we want to draw a conclusion to their own worldview, but we also want to open the door for them to commit. I told the story last night at dinner, and we'll wrap up. There's a young man that came to the Blacksburg Church of Christ about 2 years ago. Walked in, talked to the minister for about 2 minutes. He sent me over this way. Said, hey, this guy's name's Braden. He wants to talk to you real quick. So I said, hey, what's going on, Braden? He goes, yeah, man, I've grown up my whole life and I'm an atheist. I'm trying to figure life out. When can we meet? Well, that was easy. I didn't have to do anything there. Little did I know that we would spend the next year every single Tuesday with him grilling me with questions about Christianity. And the first thing that I did in that first conversation that I had with somebody, this is especially true with strangers, I just want to know who they are. I just want to know who they are, how they grew up, what their family history is, and what's their religious background. I want to know the person. I want to share my story with them share my story with me. Now that we have a rapport with one another, now that we're building trust with one another, I can sit down in the next day and say, okay, ask me a question. His first question out the gate. First two questions out the gate. One, how do I know that God exists? Two is, what do you do as a Christian with LGBTQ plus trans issues? Well, thanks for that. But we can't have that conversation unless we trust each other in the beginning. So he asked me the question. He said, well, what do you do with LGBTQ plus trans issues? And I said, hey, great question. Great question. Here's what I do. Here's what I want to do with this now. That's a great question. We'll get to that. But first thing we need to do is we need to figure out whether God exists or not. Because if God exists or doesn't exist, it answers that question. So what do you think? All right, let's stay on course. And in the next session, we'll talk a little bit about that, and then we'll move into does God exist? So any questions about what we've looked at so far as changing minds in the marketplace? You cannot change a mind if you don't talk to people. If you're scared of talking to people, it's time to overcome some fears. All right? Jesus doesn't say go and make disciples only if you're an extrovert. Never said that. Right? So if you're introverted, we got to move past it. All right. Any questions, comments? Anything at all? Insults, I'll take those too. I'll take those too. Right. Yeah. So, and that's going to be important for your younger generation. I just saw a stat the other day at a conference that during COVID, 10 to 13% of 13 to 25-year-olds were contacted by church leadership in the church. And then we throw our hands up and be like, where'd they all go? Well, nobody's talking to them. If nobody's talking to them, why would they stay? Right? So here's a book. I know, digital copies of things are kind of the deal, but here's a book that all this stuff comes from that I learned. It's a book called Tactics. A book called Tactics by Greg Koukl, Koukl. Greg Koukl. It's a really, really small book, but it walks you through all of these particular points. He calls it the Columbo tactic. Anybody remember the show Columbo? Yeah. What was the show? Dragnet? Just the Facts, ma'am? Right? And so this for me, it's been transformative in the way that I engage college students. I engage college students every day, for 28 or 38, 39 weeks. And so they have questions, and this is how I've been able to operate. Long story short, with Braden, Braden called me up, January of 2024? And he was like, I'm ready. I said, ready for what? He goes, I'm ready to be a disciple. I'm like, okay. So I baptized him in a cold river on January 21st of last year, and it was cold, brother. Like legs going numb. And then his girlfriend was a different story. Like she wasn't the analytical atheist. She was the spiritual but not religious. Right? So you come at that from a different avenue, right? And so in May, that following May, she was just like, hey, I'm ready. I want to be baptized in the same river. I'm like, it probably won't be as cold, but we can do that, And so those questions are paramount. I'll just say this. I know I said last thing, but I'm a preacher and we're long-winded. So the biggest thing to your conversations with people is to not get upset. It's not to get frustrated. Think about this for a second. Anybody here know anything about mechanical engineering in here? Yeah. So if the mechanical engineer comes and talks to you about mechanical engineering, the only way that he's going to be successful in teaching you about mechanical engineering is not getting upset and understanding that you don't know anything about mechanical engineering. So it makes a good teacher. It's meeting people where they are. So you can't go into a conversation with somebody and expect them to get it after the first 10 conversations. They're not. It is a practice of patience and a practice of love with the person on the other end. Don't feed the horse the whole hay bale, right? So if you do that, if you model Christianity consistently in your life, if you're patient with people, and you ask the right questions, knowing where that person is, I'm not saying you're going to put 100% of the people in the water. Don't hear me say that. But you'll have better, more constructive conversations with people who probably come to the conversation already prejudging who you are because you're a Christian. All right? All right, so that's session 1. Next, we will look at the case for God's existence. We'll utilize 2 arguments there. Go ahead.
5 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah, go for it. Drink a watermelon Red Bull, Cole's favorite,